This episode contains discussion of real-world violence, including murder and assault. It is explored with care, but some listeners may find it difficult. Please take care whilst listening. By the end of the 1970s, the Yorkshire Ripper investigation had become increasingly shaped by one central belief: that the voice heard on the Wearside tape belonged to the killer. What had initially been treated as a possible lead was gradually becoming something far more influential. Detectives committed enormous amounts of time, manpower, and investigative focus towards identifying the man behind the recording, while the tape itself began reshaping how the investigation imagined the offender responsible for years of violence across Yorkshire. The voice influenced which suspects appeared convincing, which lines of inquiry felt increasingly credible, and which possibilities began drifting further from investigative focus altogether. Psychologically, that shift matters enormously, because once a particular explanation becomes emotionally embedded strongly enough inside a large institution, people do not simply investigate through it. They begin interpreting reality through it as well. And by now, after more than 5 years of violence, fear, criticism, and public scrutiny, certainty carried emotional value far beyond simple evidence. It carried the possibility that the chaos might finally be ending. But while investigators increasingly chased the voice on the tape, the real killer remained active. And the consequences of that growing certainty were only just beginning to unfold. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have your company. I'm Jenny. I love history, and I am fascinated by the moments where human psychology collides with it in the worst possible ways. This is Hidden Chronicles. Season 3, The Yorkshire Ripper. Episode 10, Chasing the Voice. As investigative focus increasingly narrowed around the Wearside tape, the inquiry itself was continuing to expand on a massive scale. Tens of thousands of statements had already been collected. Thousands of men had been interviewed or considered as potential suspects. Multiple police forces had become involved as pressure surrounding the case intensified across Britain, whilst newspapers and television coverage followed developments with growing scrutiny and frustration. And despite the enormous scale of the investigation, the killer still had not been identified. That failure carried enormous emotional weight, not only for investigators, but for entire communities living alongside years of fear and uncertainty. Families continued grieving loved ones already lost to violence. Women continued altering routines around fear that the attacks could happen again. And across Yorkshire, exhaustion had become deeply embedded within ordinary life itself. Inside that atmosphere, the tape offered something emotionally powerful: direction, clarity, a voice attached to years of terror. And psychologically, human beings often cling more tightly to explanations that appear capable of restoring order after prolonged uncertainty and fear. Because uncertainty is emotionally exhausting, especially when it lasts for years. As belief in the tape strengthened, the accent heard on the recording gradually began reshaping the direction of the inquiry itself. Investigators increasingly focused upon men believed capable of matching the voice, whilst assumptions connected to geography, speech, and regional identity became more deeply embedded within investigative thinking. And over time, those assumptions began investigating not only who attracted investigative attention, but who appeared less likely to fit the emerging image of the killer. Psychologically, this reflects one of the most dangerous aspects of tunnel vision. Not because contradictory evidence disappears entirely, but because emotionally established beliefs begin shaping which information feels convincing and which information gradually loses priority. Meanwhile, suspects who failed to align clearly with the growing narrative surrounding the tape risked becoming increasingly difficult to prioritise psychologically within the investigation itself. Not necessarily because evidence against them no longer existed, but because the investigation had become increasingly organised around a particular understanding of who the killer was believed to be. And once certainty becomes emotionally embedded strongly enough, institutions can gradually begin protecting that certainty without fully realising it. Outside police stations and investigative meetings, the psychological impact of the case continued reshaping ordinary life across Yorkshire. Women planned journeys differently. Nighttime travel carried increasing negotiation around safety and risk. Families worried constantly when loved ones travelled alone after dark, whilst fear remained deeply embedded across communities forced to live alongside years of unresolved violence. And over time, that kind of prolonged fear changes people. Because the nervous system is not designed to remain inside constant anticipation indefinitely. Chronic fear reshapes behaviour, relationships, routines, and the way human beings experience ordinary life itself. Darkness begins feeling different. Isolation feels different. Independence feels different. Eventually, safety stops feeling assumed and begins feeling conditional. For many women, the psychological weight of the investigation existed not only through headlines or television coverage, but through the exhausting reality of living for years alongside uncertainty that never fully disappeared. At the same time, the investigation itself had developed enormous institutional momentum. Thousands of hours had already been committed to the inquiry. Public expectations remained immense, whilst increasing investigative resources continued being directed toward the belief that the tape represented the clearest path towards identifying the killer. And psychologically, the larger a belief system becomes, the harder it often becomes to challenge emotionally, especially when careers, reputations, public confidence, and years of investigative effort begin attaching themselves to that belief. Psychologists sometimes describe this as escalation of commitment, the tendency for individuals or institutions to continue investing in a particular course of action because so much has already been invested emotionally, publicly, or professionally. Importantly, this process rarely feels irrational from inside the situation itself. Often, it feels responsible, necessary, even unavoidable. Meanwhile, public pressure surrounding the investigation continued intensifying. Newspapers questioned police progress. Television coverage followed developments closely. And growing frustration increasingly reflected public fear that years of investigation still had not brought safety or certainty. Because during periods of prolonged uncertainty, human beings naturally seek reassurance from authority. We want evidence that danger is being controlled, understood, and contained. And when reassurance remains absent for too long, distrust and frustration often begin growing alongside fear itself. That created an almost impossible emotional environment for investigators. Pressure to move quickly, pressure to prevent further attacks, pressure to reassure the public, as well as pressure to finally end years of violence that had already reshaped communities across Yorkshire. Under those conditions, certainty can begin feeling emotionally safer than uncertainty itself, even when that certainty is flawed. Looking back now, it can be tempting to ask how such enormous investigative focus became attached so strongly to the tape and the voice recordings. But understanding that process requires understanding the emotional atmosphere surrounding the case itself. Years of violence, years of criticism, years of fear, of exhaustion, years of communities attempting to continue ordinary life alongside extraordinary uncertainty. Inside that environment, certainty became more than investigative direction. It became emotional relief. The possibility that fear was finally becoming understandable. That chaos might finally be ending. That years of uncertainty might finally give way to answers. But emotionally convincing explanations are not always accurate explanations. And as the investigation continued narrowing towards the voice on the tape, the consequences of misplaced certainty continued deepening. Before we close, it's important to pause once again and remember the people whose lives remained at the centre of this investigation throughout every stage of the case. women including Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson, Irene Richardson, Jean Jordan, Josephine Whitaker, Barbara Leach, and others were not simply names attached to a criminal investigation. They were human beings whose lives, families, relationships, futures, and identities existed long before public attention became attached to the violence that ended them. And recognising that really matters. Because behind every investigative decision, every media headline, every psychological discussion, and every institutional failing, there existed real human grief. In the next episode, we continue exploring how growing contradictions, mounting pressure, and increasing investigative strain began challenging the direction that the Yorkshire Ripper investigation had taken, as the gap between certainty and reality continued widening. Thank you for listening. I'm really glad you joined me. If you're enjoying Hidden Chronicles, be sure to follow along so that you don't miss what comes next. As always, take care and be gentle with what history leaves behind.